The house was roughly 5 meters long, built from dry stacked fieldstone without mortar and shared with animals. There was no furniture. One clay lamp burned olive oil for perhaps 2 hours after dark before the room went completely black. This is where Jesus of Nazareth grew up, and almost nothing about it matches the image most of the world carries in its mind. Stand at the edge of the lower Galilean highlands and look south toward the Jezreel Valley. The year is somewhere in the first decade of the first century of the Common Era. The land rolling out before you is terraced in stone walls built over centuries of patient agricultural labour, retaining thin strips of soil on hillsides that would otherwise shed everything in the winter rains. Olive groves follow the contours of the ridges. The barley fields fill the lower valley floors in spring. Narrow animal paths connect one village to the next, and scattered across this landscape in clusters of flat-roofed stone, perched at the heads of defensible valleys, sit small settlements. Not towns, not cities. Villages of a few hundred people at most, organised around kinship networks, dependent on seasonal rainfall, and connected to the wider world through Roman roads that primarily served to move tribute out of the province and soldiers in. This is the territory of Lower Galilee, administered in the first century of the Common Era by Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. Antipas was not a king in the full Roman sense. He was a tetrarch, a ruler of a portion, appointed by Rome and maintained in power as long as he kept order and kept tax revenue flowing toward the imperial treasury. He administered the territory with a combination of political calculation and occasional brutality, building new cities, managing Jewish religious sensitivities with care, and extracting from the peasant population of his territory a level of tribute that left almost no margin for error. The village identified in all four Gospels as the hometown of Jesus was called Nazareth. Archaeological surveys at the site have found first-century remains consistent with a small agricultural community. Simple stone dwellings built into the hillside rock, grain storage pits cut into bedrock, fragments of olive press installations, and rock-cut tombs typical of Jewish burial practice in the period. No inscription, no coin mint, on no evidence of any public architecture. The settlement is not mentioned in any first-century non-Christian historical source, not in the voluminous writings of Josephus, who catalogued dozens of Galilean villages by name, not in any Roman administrative document, not in the rabbinic literature of the period. Nazareth was a village so small it did not register in the record-keeping apparatus of its age. Population estimates based on the excavated settlement footprint place first-century Nazareth at somewhere between 200 and 400 residents. That is a range consistent with a village of perhaps 40 to 60 households, organised around extended family networks, sharing communal water sources, threshing floors and olive presses, and farming the hillside terraces and lower valley plots that surrounded the settlement. And everyone in this village knew everyone else. Every family's business was visible to every other family. There was no anonymity and very little privacy, and both of those conditions shaped what it meant to grow up there. Now here is the detail that reframes everything that follows. 6 kilometers from Nazareth, easily reached in under 2 hours on foot, sat the city of Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was not a village. Herod Antipas chose it as his primary administrative capital and invested heavily in its reconstruction following its destruction during the widespread uprising that broke out after Herod the Great's death in 4 BCE. The rebuilt Sepphoris was a proper Hellenistic urban centre, paved streets, a theatre with seating for an estimated 3,000 spectators, colonnaded public spaces, residential quarters decorated with mosaic floors, and a sophisticated water and sewage infrastructure that served a population of perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 people. This city was under active construction for decades during the first century, and that construction required enormous amounts of skilled labour. Stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, tile setters, and common labourers of all kinds. It drew workers from the surrounding villages. Galilean craftsmen from settlements, including Nazareth, had a consistent source of wage labour within walking distance of their homes. This proximity to an active Hellenistic construction site is the context in which the Gospels place a man named Joseph, described in the texts using the Greek word tekton. The translation carpenter is technically accurate but incomplete. A tekton in 1st century Palestine was a craftsman who worked with both wood and stone, taking contracts for construction, repair, and manufactured goods. He built things, he fixed things, he shaped the physical environment in which others lived, and in the shadow of a city being rebuilt from the ground, up 6 kilometres to the north, he had steady work available if he was willing to walk to it. But here is where the comfortable image begins to break down completely. The house Joseph and his family lived in while this construction boom played out around them was not a craftsman's workshop with a comfortable home attached. It was a one-room stone structure shared with the family's animals. And before we can understand anything about the person who grew up inside it, we need to stand inside that room and let it tell us what it was. Step inside. The first thing that registers is the smell. A 1st century Galilean shepherd's house was not divided into human living space and animal space by a wall or a door. The animals occupied the lower section of the interior floor. Sheep and goats, a donkey in a household of modest means. They were inside the structure, not in a separate outbuilding, separated from the human area by a low stone step that raised the human living platform above the animal floor by perhaps 20 to 30 centimetres. The smell of dung, of unwashed animal fleece, of the sourness of fermented milk, and the sharp edge of urine on packed earth was the baseline scent of home. The logic of this design was practical and effective in equal measure. The body heat generated by a small flock of sheep and goats can raise the interior temperature of an enclosed stone room by several measurable degrees. In the Galilean highlands, where winter nights can drop close to freezing and stone walls absorb and radiate cold for hours after sunset, those extra degrees were the difference between tolerably cold and dangerously cold for the household sleeping on their mats above. The animals were not a concession to poverty. They were part of the heating infrastructure. The structure itself was simple enough that archaeologists can reconstruct it in considerable detail from excavation evidence across multiple Galilean sites. The walls were dry stacked fieldstone, unhewn rocks collected from the surrounding hillsides, laid without mortar, relying entirely on their weight and the care of their fitting for structural stability. The roof was flat, constructed from wooden beams laid horizontally across the walls and covered with a deep layer of packed clay. Wooden beams were expensive in a region with limited timber resources. A household might pass the same roof beams down through multiple generations, reusing them as long as they held. In good dry weather, the flat roof became living and working space, a place to dry figs, process wool, sleep in the heat of summer. In the heavy winter rains of the Galilean highlands, it leaked. The clay required re-rolling and repacking after every significant downpour, a maintenance task that fell to the household and was never permanently solved. The interior dimensions ran roughly 5 to 7 metres in length and 3 to 4 metres in width. Interior ceiling height over the human platform was perhaps 2 metres. The total livable floor area for a household of 4 to 6 people was comparable to the floor space of a modern parking space. There was no window in any modern sense of the word. Light entered through the doorway when the door was open and through 1 or 2 small openings cut into the upper wall that served primarily as smoke vents rather than light sources. When the door was shut against the cold or the rain, the interior was very dark during the day and completely dark after nightfall. The only artificial light source was a clay oil lamp, a simple pinched ceramic bowl design, perhaps 12 centimetres across, that held a wick soaked in olive oil. The lamp produced roughly the illumination of a single candle. Burning it through an evening consumed oil. Oil cost money. A household that burned a lamp throughout every evening was a household with enough olive oil surplus to afford to do so. Many evenings ended when the lamp was extinguished and the family lay down on their mats in the dark. This is where one of the most recognizable parables in the Gospels comes from. Luke describes a woman who has 10 silver coins, loses one, lights a lamp, and sweeps the entire house carefully until she finds it. Read that image against this room, a single oil lamp producing the light of one candle, a packed earth floor that can swallow a small coin against its surface, a dark enclosed space where the lamp has to be carried from corner to corner to make a systematic search possible. The sweep is methodical because the loss is real and the floor is dark and the coin matters. 1 coin in 10 is 10% of the household's accessible liquid savings. This is not a story about a wealthy person losing a minor amount. It is a story about a household whose total cash reserve fits in one hand, losing 10% of that to the darkness of a stone floor. The relief at finding it is proportionate to what finding it actually meant for the family's situation. The morning in this house began before the sky went light. In a first-century Galilean household, bread was not purchased. It was not prepared once a week and stored. It was produced fresh every single day from raw grain because there was no way to store ground flour against insects and moisture in an unlined stone room shared with animals. The grain, untypically barley for poorer households and emmer wheat when available and affordable, was kept in sealed ceramic storage jars. Each morning, a measured amount was poured onto the lower stone of a rotary hand quern. A rotary quern consisted of 2 circular grinding stones, each roughly 40 centimetres in diameter. The lower stone was fixed, slightly convex on its upper surface, set into the packed earth of the floor or into a clay base. The upper stone had a central hole through which grain was fed and a handle peg on its outer edge by which it was rotated. One hand fed grain continuously into the central hole. The other hand drove the rotating upper stone in its circular path. The motion was continuous, repetitive, and physically demanding. 2 to 3 hours. That was the typical time required to grind enough flour for one day's bread for a family. Not 1 hour, not 30 minutes. 2 to 3 hours of continuous hand grinding before the flour was ready, before the dough could be made, before the bread could be shaped and baked. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from this period and this region is specific about the physical cost. Women's skeletons from 1st century Palestinian sites show consistent patterns of stress damage in the shoulder joints, the lower vertebrae, and the hip bones. The damage profile matches exactly the sustained rotary motion of daily grinding performed from adolescence onward. The bones record what the texts do not say explicitly. Every woman in every household in every village of 1st century Galilee was paying for the daily bread with her body, not incrementally, morning after morning, year after year. This was the first task of every day, before the children were properly awake, before the animals were taken out to graze. The sound of grain grinding was the sound of morning in a Galilean village. While grain was being ground, fire had to be rebuilt from the previous night's embers. The cooking fire was built on a clay-lined hearth set into the floor of the human platform or against a wall. Fuel was gathered from the surrounding land. Dried animal dung was the most reliable fuel source in a region with limited timber. Vine prunings after harvest, dried thorns, whatever scraps of wood could be found. The fire served simultaneously for warmth, for bread baking, and for cooking any legumes or vegetables that were part of the meal. The smoke it generated had limited ventilation available. It rose, spread, and settled throughout the interior. The walls of excavated 1st century houses in this region show soot deposits that accumulated over generations. The interior of this house on a cold morning was warm in the way that meets immediate need while imposing its own cost on the lungs of everyone inside. Water had to be fetched. A village of Nazareth's age and size would have developed one or more communal water sources: a spring, a rock-cut cistern collecting winter rainfall, or both. The source was not piped to individual households. It was walked to and carried from. The ceramic water jars used in this period held between 15 and 20 litres when full. Full, they weighed 15 to 20 kilograms. The typical round trip from household to water source in a Galilean village ran between 200 and 400 metres. Multiple trips were required each day for drinking water, cooking water, and basic household cleaning. Do the arithmetic and let it settle. 2 to 3 hours of grain grinding. 2 to 3 water-carrying trips covering several hundred metres each while carrying up to 20 kilograms. Fire building and maintenance. Bread baking on clay griddles over the open fire. By the time a Galilean household had done nothing except produce its daily bread and secure its water supply, a substantial portion of the morning was consumed. Every other task, field labour, shepherding, tecton work, weaving, tending the flock, began only after this baseline production cycle was complete. The bread that resulted from this labour was flat bread, unleavened on most days, produced by pressing shaped rounds of dough onto the heated surface of a clay griddle or directly onto heated stones. Dense, chewy, filling, and produced fresh because it did not keep. This was the foundation of every meal. Bread was not one element of the diet in 1st century Galilee. It was the meal, supplemented by whatever was at hand. The diet that flatbread anchored was consistent and limited. Lentils and chickpeas provided the primary protein source for most days of the year. Cooked in a clay pot over the fire, seasoned with olive oil, garlic, and whatever herbs could be gathered from hillside plants. Olive oil was both a cooking medium and a significant caloric contribution to the diet, added to bread or drizzled over cooked legumes. Dried figs were a storable sweetener and caloric supplement that a household with access to a fig tree could rely on through the winter months. Olives cured in brine appeared regularly. Fresh vegetables were seasonal. Onions, garlic, leeks, and bitter herbs in spring and early summer, with the winter months narrowing the available fresh food considerably. Meat was not a feature of ordinary daily meals. A sheep or goat might be slaughtered for a festival, for a wedding, for a significant family occasion, or when an animal was sick or injured and consuming it made more practical sense than continuing to feed it through a difficult season. Fish appeared regularly in the diet of households near the Sea of Galilee, where dried and salted fish from the lake were affordable and widely available through local markets. Nazareth was roughly 40 kilometres from the lake shore, not an impossible distance for traded goods, but far enough that fresh fish was not a realistic daily option and dried fish was an occasional supplement rather than a dietary staple. And here is the detail that changes the texture of the feeding narratives permanently. When the Gospel texts describe 5 loaves and 2 fish as a provision for a day's travel, they are not using poverty as a rhetorical flourish. They are describing the actual daily food provision of a Galilean family walking between villages. 5 small flatbreads and 2 pieces of dried or salted fish. That is a realistic day's ration for 1 to 2 adults moving on foot across the Galilean countryside. The crowd of 5,000 people described in those accounts would have recognized that provision not as a symbol of scarcity, but as a description of what they themselves had packed that same morning. The power of the narrative is not that 5 loaves sounds impossibly small. It is that 5 loaves proved sufficient for 5,000 people when distributed by someone who understood the mathematics of multiplication. The physical specificity is not decorative. It is the ground on which the claim stands. The economic life of the household in which Jesus grew up operated on two tracks simultaneously, and both tracks were precarious in ways that compound each other. A shepherd in 1st century Galilee managed a mixed flock of sheep and goats on common grazing land. The work was not structured the way agricultural labour was structured. It did not follow planting and harvest seasons. It was year-round, daily, and its demands varied with the condition of the animals and the season. It required rising before dawn to move animals to grazing areas before the day's heat made the hillsides uncomfortable. It required watching for the boundaries of agricultural land that bordered the common grazing zones and negotiating their use continuously with farmers who resented the competition for vegetation. It required attention to predators. The Galilean highlands in the 1st century were not yet the cleared and cultivated landscape they would become over later centuries. Jackals were common. Hyenas inhabited the rocky terrain. Leopards still moved through the upper Galilean ranges in this period, descending occasionally to lower ground. A shepherd who lost animals to a predator did not merely suffer a setback in the abstract sense, he lost capital. He lost the breeding stock, the wool production, the milk production, and the market value of the animals taken. The loss fell on the entire household economy, and replacement was not simple when every denarius was already committed to daily survival. Wool was clipped annually and either used for household weaving or traded. Milk from sheep and goats was processed, drunk fresh when possible, soured into a drinkable yogurt-like product for storage, or slowly concentrated into a simple aged cheese that could last for months. Animals designated for temple sacrifice were a specialized trade good. The Jerusalem temple required specific unblemished animals for specific types of offerings, and a shepherd who maintained a flock that met ritual standards had a market connection extending beyond local village need. But shepherding also meant sleeping outside during lambing season, sometimes for weeks at a stretch. It meant being absent from the village for extended periods. It meant working in conditions of exposure that a craftsman working under a roof did not face. And it placed the shepherd in continuous negotiation with the legal grey zones of common land use in a society where the boundaries between legitimate grazing and unauthorised taking were not always clearly marked. The tecton track operated on entirely different rhythms. Construction and repair work was commission-based. A craftsman received a request, agreed on terms, completed the work, and was paid. With Sepphoris 6 kilometres away and under active construction during the early decades of the 1st century, the demand for skilled construction workers was consistent and physically accessible. Roman-era wage documentation from Egypt provides a benchmark that scholars treat as broadly applicable across the eastern Mediterranean in this period. A daily labourer could expect approximately 1 denarius per day. The parable of the labourers in the vineyard uses exactly this figure, 1 denarius for a full day of work, agreed upon at the beginning, and the original audience recognised it immediately as the going daily rate, neither generous nor scandalous. 1 denarius bought 1 day's supply of basic food for a family, not comfort, not savings, daily food. A tecton working consistently could meet daily needs. A tecton who lost work to weather delay, to a project that stalled mid-construction, or to a client who delayed payment had no financial reserve to draw on. 1 week without pay was the beginning of a crisis. 2 weeks was the beginning of debt, and debt was where the entire system showed its deepest logic. The financial obligations layered on a Galilean peasant household in the 1st century were not metaphorical. They were specific, recurring, and structurally designed to remain in place. Roman tribute was collected by local tax contractors, men who purchased the right to collect in a given territory by paying Rome a fixed sum in advance and then extracting whatever they could above that amount to make their investment profitable. The gap between what Rome required and what the contractor could extract was pure profit for the contractor, and it came entirely from the households of the territory. Herodian taxes added tolls on goods moving through markets and on roads. Priestly tithes required by Jewish law designated approximately 10% of all agricultural produce for the priestly class and the temple system. The poor tithe, observed in alternate years, directed a further portion toward the destitute members of the community. Stack these obligations on a household producing barley at subsistence level. After Roman tribute, Herodian taxes, and priestly tithes, a household might retain somewhere between 50 and 60% of its total production for its own consumption. In a good year with adequate rainfall, no locust swarms, and no crop disease, 50 to 60% of a full harvest was enough to eat on and to set aside a small reserve for the next season's seed grain. In a poor year, it was not enough, and when it was not enough, the household had effectively two options. Eat the reserve that was meant to provide the next season's seed, which meant borrowing seed grain at interest before planting could begin, or borrow money immediately to cover the current shortfall. Loans were available from multiple sources: local landowners who extended credit to tenant farmers in exchange for future obligations, merchants who lent against the promise of future harvests, and the temple system, which operated various financial mechanisms of its own. Interest rates varied, but rates of 20 to 30% per year were not uncommon for unsecured agricultural loans in this period and region. A household that borrowed after one bad harvest to cover its food shortfall now entered the following season, carrying the original debt plus interest. If the following season's harvest was also poor, the debt could not be serviced. At that point, the creditor had a legal claim on the land held as collateral. Debt-driven land foreclosure was so endemic in first-century Galilee that historians have been able to reconstruct the process through which the agricultural landscape was being restructured in this period. Formerly independent smallholders, families who had worked land they owned for generations, were progressively becoming tenant farmers on land that now belonged to absentee creditors. The parable of the tenants in the vineyard describes this situation with specificity. An absentee owner has leased a vineyard to tenant farmers, sends agent after agent to collect the owner's share of the harvest, and receives increasingly hostile responses from tenants who have nothing left to give. That is not a general moral story about human wickedness. It is a field report from the specific economic situation of Lower Galilee in the 1st century, and the original audience recognized it as such because many of them were either the tenants or knew the tenants personally. The religious life of the household operated as a parallel structure that ran alongside the economic one without ever separating from it. The Sabbath was not merely a weekly holiday. It was a structural feature of the calendar that required the entire preceding day to be organized around preparation. No grinding on the Sabbath, no cooking, no commercial activity, no labor of any kind beyond what was immediately necessary for survival. No travel beyond a defined walking distance. A household that had not ground enough grain on the 6th day of the week had no flour for Sabbath bread. A household that had not pre-cooked its Sabbath food went without a hot meal until Saturday night. The lamp had to be filled before sunset Friday, or it would not be lit during the Sabbath evening. Every week, without exception, the rhythm of production had to account for this 24-hour cessation. The 6th day was always preparation day, and what was not done by sunset on the 6th day was not done until the Sabbath ended. The communal religious gathering in 1st century Galilee was considerably different from the institution that most people picture when they imagine a 1st century synagogue. The formal stone synagogue building, with its carved Torah shrine, stone benches along the walls, and dedicated communal identity as a religious space, was largely a post-70 CE development, a product of the reorganization of Jewish communal life after the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple. Archaeological evidence for dedicated synagogue buildings in the Galilee region before 70 CE is limited and contested. The handful of pre-destruction structures that have been tentatively identified as synagogues are simple, undifferentiated rooms that could have served multiple community functions without any obvious religious specialization. And Torah reading and communal prayer in Nazareth during the first decades of the 1st century almost certainly occurred in open courtyards, in the home of a village elder or respected community member, or in whatever space was large enough to accommodate the gathered men of the village. This is where Jesus learned to read. Not in a formal school building with a professional teacher. In someone's courtyard, with a scroll of Torah passed between adults, with the text read aloud in Hebrew and interpreted in the Aramaic that was the daily spoken language of Galilee. The literary rate in the peasant population of 1st century Galilee was low. The ability to read a Torah scroll and to interpret its meaning in the vernacular language was not a common skill in a village whose population worked 12 to 14 hours a day producing its subsistence. That the Gospel accounts describe Jesus reading aloud in the gathering place at Nazareth and offering an interpretation that surprised the community suggests something unusual about the level of learning he had achieved, given the conditions of the household he grew up in. The annual festivals added their own demands to the household calendar. Passover was the most significant and most demanding. It required the removal of all leavened products from the household, a thorough cleaning that began several days before the festival and consumed significant time and attention, the preparation of sufficient unleavened flatbread for the entire week of the festival, and for those families who could manage the cost in time and resources, a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. From Nazareth, Jerusalem was roughly 90 kilometers to the south, 3 to 4 days of walking each way over mountainous terrain, assuming a pace of approximately 25 kilometers per day for a group traveling together, as pilgrimage groups typically did for safety and community. The round trip cost a minimum of 8 days of lost labor on top of the cost of food and any necessary accommodation along the route. Not every Galilean household made this pilgrimage every year. The temple tax of a half shekel per adult male, equivalent to roughly 2 full days of a laborer's wages, was collected annually regardless of whether a family could afford the journey. Here the layering of obligation becomes visible in its full weight. Now watch what happens when you follow the social logic further into the world that produced all of this. A Galilean peasant household in the 1st century operated inside a purity system that governed not only access to sacred space, but also legal standing and day-to-day social participation. Jewish purity law was not a minor ceremonial system observed by particularly devout individuals. It was a framework that determined who could approach the temple altar, who could participate fully in communal religious life, and whose testimony was acceptable in legal proceedings. The categories of purity and impurity applied to individuals based on their condition at any given moment. Contact with a corpse generated major impurity requiring a 7-day purification process. Handling blood, animal fluids, or a carcass generated lesser forms of impurity requiring mikveh immersion and a waiting period before the individual was again considered clean. Skin conditions of various kinds, childbirth, and numerous other circumstances created states that had to be managed through specific ritual processes. For a shepherd whose daily work involved handling animals continuously, assisting in animal births, managing injuries, and occasionally slaughtering animals for household use or market sale, the transitions in and out of states of impurity were not occasional, they were chronic. A shepherd was rarely in a stable, comfortable relationship with the purity system. He moved through it constantly, and the mikveh immersion required to restore purity was not always immediately accessible from a hillside grazing area. Ritual impurity was the normal background condition of his working life, but purity was also connected to social hierarchy in ways that operated independently of any individual's momentary ritual condition. The social structure of first-century Jewish society placed priests and Levites at its apex. The hereditary priestly class descended from Aaron, followed by the Levites who assisted in temple functions. Below them stood ordinary Israelites whose lineage was documented and could be established. Below them were those of uncertain or mixed lineage, followed by those in occupations considered inherently degraded or legally suspect. Shepherds occupied an uncomfortable position at the lower levels of this hierarchy, and the textual evidence for this is specific. Rabbinic sources from the period following the destruction of the temple, sources that likely reflect attitudes that had been developing throughout the first century, explicitly list shepherds alongside tax collectors, gambling operators, and other figures whose legal testimony was considered unreliable in formal proceedings. A shepherd's word in a legal dispute carried less weight than a landowner's word. This was not a casual social prejudice. It was a structural feature of the legal system. That is the part that stops the whole scene. Because the Hebrew scriptures are filled with honored shepherds. Abraham kept large flocks throughout his life, and the management of those flocks is woven through the narrative of his journey. Moses fled Egypt, arrived in Midian, and spent 40 years tending the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro in the wilderness, an anonymous shepherd for 4 decades before the burning bush interrupted the routine. David was the youngest son of a Bethlehem farmer, assigned the family sheep because his older brothers were old enough for tasks considered more important, and it was from that hillside that Samuel came to find him and anoint him king of Israel. The 23rd Psalm, almost certainly the most widely memorized text in the Jewish tradition, presents the God of Israel as a shepherd leading the speaker through dangerous terrain towards safety. The idealized shepherd king figure was one of the most powerful images in Israelite historical memory, and yet the actual shepherds of first-century Galilee and Judea were legally marginal, chronically impure from their work on, and economically precarious men whom the legal system did not fully trust as witnesses. The distance between the idealized shepherd of the scriptures and the actual social position of the men doing shepherd's work in Roman Palestine was enormous. That distance was not accidental or unconscious. It was the specific gap that certain New Testament texts aim directly at. Luke's Gospel announces the birth of Jesus not to priests, not to Levites, not to Torah scholars in Jerusalem, not to Israelites of documented and honored lineage. The first announcement in Luke goes to shepherds spending the night on a hillside outside Bethlehem with their flock. They are doing exactly what shepherds did, sleeping outdoors with their animals on common land, absent from the village, ritually impure from their daily work, illegally marginal in any proceeding that required witnesses. The angel in Luke's account specifically goes to the people who could not legally testify to what they were about to see. That is not incidental. It is a choice that makes full sense only against the backdrop of what a shepherd actually was in that society. The Gospel of John gives Jesus the title of Good Shepherd and develops it at length. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. This is not warm pastoral imagery. In its original first-century context, this is a pointed self-identification with a low-status, legally suspect, chronically impure figure who accepts responsibility for the flock at personal cost precisely when the person hired to do the job abandons it. Understanding the weight of that identification requires understanding exactly what the social reality of a shepherd was. Now step back inside the house. The physical conditions of daily life inside a first-century Galilean shepherd's dwelling are worth sitting with long enough to feel their full weight, because the tendency of distance is to smooth them into a general impression of simplicity rather than a specific experience of constraint. Privacy did not exist in this house. A household of 4 to 6 people occupied a single room with no interior partitions, no separate sleeping areas, and no space that could be closed off from the rest of the household. Every conversation happened in the same space where everyone else was present. Every illness was visible to everyone. Every argument was heard by everyone. Every moment of grief, of tenderness, of fear happened in the shared space of one room that measured 5 to 7 meters from end to end. There was no retreat. There was no quiet. There was one room, and it served as kitchen, sleeping area, storage facility, workspace, sick room, and living room simultaneously. The darkness after the lamp went out was not partial. Stone walls produce no ambient light. When the oil was consumed and the flame died, the interior of this house was as dark as it is possible to be. A household that could not afford to keep the lamp burning all evening, or that ran low on oil, and ended the night in complete darkness. A child waking in the night in this space woke into absolute black with the sounds of animals below and the breathing of family members nearby. Smoke was a constant presence. An open cooking fire in an enclosed space with minimal ventilation fills that space with smoke. Every morning's bread baking, every evening meal cooked, every fire kept burning through a cold night contributed to the smoke load in the air. The walls of excavated first-century stone houses in the Galilean region show carbonized deposits on the interior surfaces that represent decades of accumulated cooking smoke. The people living inside breathed this every day of their lives. The skeletal record speaks to another cost. The archaeological analysis of women's remains from first-century Palestinian sites documents consistent wear patterns in the shoulder joints, the lower vertebrae, and the hip socket, damage that matches the biomechanical profile of repetitive grain-grinding motion performed from adolescence onward. Women in this society paid for the daily bread with measurable progressive damage to their own bodies, and the evidence is preserved in the bones of women who died 2,000 years ago in villages whose names most people have never heard. Childhood mortality in the 1st century CE across the eastern Mediterranean has been reconstructed from burial demographics with grim consistency. Estimates place the child mortality rate before the age of 5 at somewhere between 40 and 50% in peasant household populations of this period and region. Infectious disease, malnutrition, intestinal parasites, birth complications, and untreated injuries all contributed to a rate of child death that made losing children not an exceptional tragedy but a recurring experience of ordinary family life. A household of 6 in 1st century Galilee had almost certainly lost children. The grief was not processed through specialized support structures. It was absorbed into the continuing daily labor of survival. Disease was managed through whatever the household had access to. Folk remedies transmitted through family knowledge, prayer, communal religious response, and occasional consultation with individuals who had a local reputation for healing knowledge. Medical practitioners in the sense of trained physicians with knowledge of anatomy and pharmacology existed in cities and were accessible to people who could afford their services. They were not accessible to rural peasant households in villages of 400 people. A Galilean family dealing with serious illness managed it largely with what they had and with what the village community could offer. This is the context that surrounds the healing narratives in the Gospels with specific weight. When the texts describe crowds of sick people gathering wherever Jesus went, pressing toward him, reaching for him, bringing family members on stretchers. The descriptions are not hyperbole. They are describing the population of a rural region with no reliable access to medical care, where illness was managed through religious practice and folk remedy, where the appearance of someone who could actually heal was not a spiritual curiosity, but a matter of urgent practical survival. The desperation visible in those crowd scenes makes complete historical sense once you understand what it was to be sick in a Galilean village. And here is where the historical reconstruction arrives at the question it has been building toward all along. Every image in the teaching of Jesus that has become, through 2,000 years of use, a general spiritual symbol, was once a specific reference to a specific physical world. And the physical world it referred to was this one: the stone room, the clay lamp, the grinding stone, the packed earth floor, the flat leaking roof, the animals on the lower level, the children who did not all survive, the debt that waited at the edge of every season, the smoke, the darkness, the daily labour that had to be completed before any other work could begin. Consider the parable of the lost coin again, with the room present in the mind. A woman has 10 silver coins. She loses one. She lights a lamp and sweeps the entire house carefully until she finds it. 3 details. The lamp is necessary because the room is dark during daylight hours. The sweep is necessary because a packed earth floor shared with animals is textured and varied enough to hide a small coin. The 10 coins are her entire accessible cash holding. 1 coin is 10% of everything. The relief when she finds it and calls her neighbours to celebrate is not disproportionate. It is exact. Consider the parable of the leaven. A woman takes a small amount of leaven and works it into 3 measures of flour. 3 measures is a large amount of dough, enough for a substantial celebration feast, but the action described is ordinary domestic production. A woman at her grinding stone and her clay griddle, working the leaven into the flour the way she worked it every morning. The transformation being described is hidden in the most ordinary labour imaginable. The audience listening to this parable understood it in a way that only people who knew that morning labour from the inside could understand. The kingdom of heaven, the text suggests, works the way leaven works in bread, hidden, invisible during the process, and recognizable only in the result. That image has exactly the weight it needs when the grinding stone is present. Consider the request for daily bread. The Greek word in the Lord's Prayer, typically translated as daily, has no clear parallel in other Greek texts of the period, which suggests it may have been coined to describe something for which ordinary language had no precise term. The bread needed for this day, not bread in general, not bread for the future, but the specific bread that this specific morning's grinding was meant to produce. In a household with no stored flour surplus and no financial reserve against a bad harvest, the request for today's bread named a genuine daily anxiety that was not metaphorical for any of the people who first said it. Consider the instruction not to worry about what you will eat or drink or wear. Laia, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. The birds have no storehouse. And for a significant portion of the audience hearing this, neither did they. The instruction was not counsel to comfortable people to cultivate a spirit of gratitude for abundance they already had. It was instruction addressed to people who woke up every morning knowing that the day's bread depended on the day's grinding, and that one bad harvest separated them from debt that could cost them their land. The instruction is not less demanding for having been addressed to people in those conditions. It is considerably more demanding. Consider the parable of the house built on rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. In the Galilean highlands, This distinction between rock foundation and sand foundation was not abstract architectural advice. The valleys that cut through the Galilean hills channeled enormous volumes of water during the heavy rains of winter. A house set on the sandy alluvial deposit at the valley floor could be undermined and carried in flood season. A house cut into the bedrock of a hillside slope, its foundation stone sitting directly on the living rock of the hill, would not move. Galilean builders knew this distinction from experience. Excavations at Capernaum and elsewhere confirm the pattern. Houses built where possible directly onto bedrock, with foundations cut into the living stone. The parable described a choice that any builder in the region understood immediately and concretely. 2,000 years of interpretation have done what interpretation over very long periods of time always does. They have smoothed the surfaces of these images into a kind of general luminosity that is beautiful but that has lost its specific physical texture. The lamp is now a symbol. The lost coin is now a principle. The shepherd is now a pastoral image of gentleness. The daily bread is now a theological statement about providence. The house on rock is now a motivational aphorism about building your life on solid foundations. What these images actually were, before they became any of those things, was a set of specific references to a specific material world that a specific group of people in a specific place and time recognized immediately from the inside. A dark stone room, a packed earth floor, a single oil lamp that had to be lit to find anything after dark, a woman whose shoulders ached from the morning's grinding, animals breathing below the sleeping platform, a man who slept outside with his flock on a cold hillside and could not legally testify in court about what he had seen, a family whose entire cash savings fit in 10 coins, a house built on rock that stood while the valley floor houses went down in the winter floods. The theological claim at the centre of the New Testament is not that God appeared in comfort or in power or in the trappings of recognised religious authority. It is that the person at the centre of that claim grew up in a dry stacked stone room of 5 to 7 metres with animals, in a village of 400 people that was never recorded in any document of its time, in a family whose economic position placed them 1 bad harvest away from debt and 2 bad harvests away from the loss of whatever land they held, in a household whose women paid for the daily bread with measurable progressive damage to their own bones. Historical understanding does not soften that claim. It makes the claim specific. And specificity is what separates a claim that can be examined from a claim that can only be felt at a comfortable distance. What does it mean that the teaching that has shaped more human culture than any other in the last 2,000 years came from inside a room that smelled of dung and cooking smoke, that went dark 2 hours after nightfall, that measured perhaps 5 metres from end to end, and that is understood by far more people today as a kind of warm pastoral backdrop than as the specific and exacting material reality it actually was? That question has no comfortable answer, but it is the question that standing inside that house for long enough eventually asks.